Hello everyone, thank you for joining us on Books on Demand, a show that introduces the excellence of Korean literature to the world and explores notable literary works. Today we will talk about Hwang Sun-won's short story, Cranes. I'm your host, Jenny Jo, and I'll be back shortly. Let's go crane hunting before we go! Writer Hwang Sun-won might have written Cranes just to say this single sentence. The short suggestion, let's go crane hunting, unties the knot of misunderstanding between the two main characters in the story and turns a tense situation into a moment of reconciliation and healing. Let's find out how hunting for cranes came to play such a crucial role in the two men's lives. The text reads, "The village north of the 38th parallel line was quite peaceful under the high, clear autumn sky. On the dirt floor of a vacant house, white gourds were left rolling, propped up against each other. An old man he happened to come across first hid his pipe behind his back. Children left the road well ahead of him. Overall, the village seemed to have suffered little damage from the war. But for some reason, it didn't appear to be the old village where he had grown up. Hwang Sun-won's Cranes is set in a village located just north of the 38th parallel line during the Korean War. Here's Professor Bang Min-ho of Seoul National University's Korean Literature Department to explain more.
1945년 8.15에 이제 일제강점으로부터
When Korea gained independence from colonial Japan on August 15, 1945, U.S. forces occupied south of the 38th parallel, while the Soviet troops were stationed to the north. The Korean peninsula was divided as soon as it was liberated. In August 1948, the government of the Republic of Korea was founded, with the North in the process of declaring its own government, subsequently opening the era of division with two different governments set up north and south of the 38th parallel line. 2 years later, on June 25, 1950, the Korean War broke out between the two Koreas. Seoul was captured by North Korean forces in just 3 days, and Daejeon fell around July 20th. But Seoul was taken back 3 months later on September 28th, with a successful Incheon landing on September 15, 1950, and, building on this momentum, the South Korean army and UN forces advanced to the north. This story takes place in a village near the 38th parallel line, which is very symbolic. That means the village is situated near the border.
것 자체도 매우 상징적인 의미를 갖고 있어요. 바로 남과 북의 접경지대에 있다라는 거죠.
Cranes was published in the May 1953 edition of the journal Shincheonji. At the end of the story, the author wrote that the manuscript was completed in January 1953, which means that it was written during the Korean War. Hwang Sun-won was born in Pyeongan-namdo province in 1915 during the Japanese colonial period. He started writing poems at age 16 and wrote more than 100 poems and 100 short stories, as well as several long novels over his lifetime. Most of his works have to do with the painful, unfortunate history of modern Korea. Here's literary critic Chun So-young to tell us more.
작가 황순원은 한국 현대사의 질곡을 자기의 삶으로서 모두 뼈아프게
Hwang Sun-won had experienced all the chaotic unrest and violence of Korea's modern history throughout his life. He was born under the Japanese imperial reign and worked as a professional poet with Japanese oppression always looming over him. In 1946, immediately after Korea's liberation, he left his hometown in Pyeongan-namdo and came down south to suffer through the Korean War in the south. He kept writing until the 1980s, so it can be said that he had experienced modern Korea with all his being. His works steadfastly contain his faith in humanity, which cannot be destroyed by any ideology. This overarching theme was expressed through his very poetic and sensitive writing and use of metaphor. Cranes is a beautiful manifestation of Hwang's spirit.
학이라는 이 소설은 그런 작가의 정수가 아름답게 드러난 소설이라고 할 수 있겠습니다.
There are two main characters in the story. One is Seong-sam, who was working as a village security officer after his hometown was taken back from the North Korean forces during the Korean War. The other protagonist is Deok-jae, Seong-sam's boyhood friend, but he is brought to the village security office for having collaborated with the North Koreans. The story begins with a surprise and awkward encounter between these once best friends. The text reads, When he arrived at a house used as a temporary security office, he found a young man tied up with a rope. Since young people are hardly seen in this village, he walked up and peered into the man's face, only to be taken completely by surprise. The young man was Deok-jae, his best friend from his childhood. He asked another security officer who had escorted him from Cheontae what had happened. The guard explained that the young man had been deputy chief of a farmers' alliance and that they had caught him hiding in the guard's home. Seong-sam sat on the dirt floor and lit a cigarette. Deok-jae was to be escorted under guard to Cheongdan. I will take this fellow myself, he said. Seong-sam volunteers to take Deok-jae himself. Cranes takes place over the course of half a day when Seong-sam escorts Deok-jae to Cheongdan. During those few hours, the two characters are bombarded with various memories from their childhood. It's also interesting to see how their psychological states change little by little over time and space. Here's Professor Bang Min-ho again.
38선 접경 완충지대 쪽으로 이렇게 덕재가 끌려가도록 설정해 있고
Deok-jae is supposed to be taken to the buffer zone near the 38th parallel line, over the hill and across the field. The field, where they used to hunt for cranes, brought back a flood of memories from their boyhood. The hilly road, which leads down to the field, represents a place where the two friends' ideological differences come to a blow and their emotional bonds are forgotten, while the field is where they can look back at their younger years and work out their differences, and find the deep bond that allows them to reconcile with each other. This important message is delivered through a concise, clear, and more structured storyline unrolled along the topographical layout.
짜임새가 아주 잘 짜여진 그런 스토리 구조로 보여주고 있다고 할 수 있죠.
Seong-sam starts smoking as soon as he leads Deok-jae out of the village. He must have felt quite uncomfortable at the fact that he's taking his closest friend to his doom. As they leave the village entrance, he remembers smoking a pumpkin leaf cigarette with Deok-jae. That flashback opened the gate of childhood memories. In the author's words, once, when they were little, Seong-sam and Deok-jae went to steal chestnuts from the house of an old man with a lump on his cheek. It was Seong-sam's turn to climb up the tree. He suddenly heard the old man yelling. He slipped and fell from the tree. Chestnut burr needles pricked his bottom, but they just kept running. Only after putting enough distance between them and the old man, Seong-sam turned his bottom toward Deok-jae. It was stinging and painful to take out the needles. He began to tear up. All of a sudden, Deok-jae took out a handful of his own chestnuts and put them in Seong-sam's pocket. As we just read, Seong-sam throws away a newly lit cigarette when he recalled how he had teared up from the pain of pulling out chestnut burr needles and how Deok-jae had crammed chestnuts in his pocket. He thought it was selfish for him to smoke when Deok-jae must be craving a cigarette himself. The two men arrive at a hilly path. It was the same hill the two used to frequent in order to get firewood from the pre-independence days until Seong-sam moved away. That's where Seong-sam strikes up a conversation with Tokje. In the story, he says, "Hey, how many people have you killed?" Tokje glanced over at him and then turned away. "Hey, I asked you, how many people have you killed?" Tokje again turned his head toward him and glared at Seong-sam. His eyes flashed and his lips sporting a stubbled beard started to twitch. "How about you? Have you killed someone?" Seong-sam was shocked, but felt his heart grow lighter, as if something that had stuck tight had been removed. Seong-sam then asks his friend why he was hiding in the security agent's house. With his fingers around the holstered gun, he threatens Tokje to tell the truth, saying that he could be shot to death. But out of the blue, Tokje begins to talk about his father. He says, "My father is ill at home. He's been sick for a year and a half already." Tokje's father was a poor farmer, a widower growing old with Tokje as a sole companion. "I too thought about carrying my father to flee from war, but my father was against it. He said, where would a farmer go, leaving behind the crops ready to harvest?" That caused Seong-sam to think of his own father. Last June, when he had brought up the subject of evacuation, his father had said the same thing as Tokje's father. Having left his hometown, Seong-sam often worried about leaving the farm work to his elderly parents and his young wife. Without realizing, Seong-sam slowly began relating to Tokje's situation. The two friends passed over the hill, absorbing the still, sizzling autumn sunshine and thinking it's the perfect weather for threshing. When they came down to the flat land, they spotted a flock of cranes, resembling people in white clothes bent down at the waist. Seong-sam soon remembers the time when he went crane hunting with Tokje. The text reads, "It happened when Seong-sam and Tokje were about 12 years old. They once set a trap without telling adults and caught a crane. It was a red-crowned crane. They tied the wings with a straw cord and then came out every day to stroke its neck, climb on its back, and make a fuss. Then one day, they heard village grown-ups whisper, someone from Seoul had come to hunt cranes. He even had permission from the Japanese Governor General to make a specimen." The two raced to the field. Their only thought was that their crane must not be killed. Without stopping to take a breath, they crawled between the weeds and undid the snare around the crane's ankle and untied the rope around the wings. But the crane could hardly walk properly, probably from being tied down and tormented all that time. The two carried the crane in their arms and threw it into the air. The crane flapped its wings a couple of times, but fell down to the ground. When the crane fell to the ground, the two boys must have been hit by the guilt that the crane was shot because of them. And the story continues like this. But then a red-crowned crane spread its wings from the bush right next to them. Their crane, which had fallen from the sky, let out a cry from its long neck. It flew up in the air and circled above the boys' heads before flying off far into the other side. The red-crowned crane, featuring a bright red spot at the top of its head, symbolizes the Korean people. The sight of two red-crowned cranes, feared to have been shot, soaring up to the sky implies that the two men's friendship has been restored and their conflict resolved. Professor Bang Min-ho explains more.
그 어린 성삼이나 덕재의 키를 생각해 보면 학은 성삼이나
Given the height of
덕재만큼이나
Seong-sam
큰
or Dokjae,
크랭이에요.
the crane must have been as tall as the boys, but they captured the animal and tormented it in captivity. The boys did not mean to kill it, but play with it, since they thought of the field as their playground and everything that lives in the field as their friend. That's why they are horrified when a real hunter comes to kill a crane. So they hurry to free the bird, which luckily escapes the hunter's bullets. It is beautiful to read the passage in which the crane spreads its wings and flies off. I think it's great for a writer to come up with such a story.
그 장면이 굉장히 아름답죠. 소설가가 이런 소설을 쓸 수 있으면 참 좋은 거라고 생각이 돼요.
Now we come to the conclusion of the short story. Having remembered the childhood memory about their beloved crane, Seong-sam suddenly brings up crane hunting. In the story it says again, "Hey, let's go crane hunting before we go." Seong-sam spoke all of a sudden, not knowing what he was talking about. Tokjae looked on, puzzled. "I will make a snare with this. You drive the cranes." Seong-sam untied the rope and held it in his hand. Soon, he was already crawling on the grassy field. But the blood drained out of Tokjae's face. What Seong-sam had said about being shot to death flashed through his mind. Far off, Seong-sam suddenly looked back. "Hey, why are you just standing there like an idiot? Go and drive the cranes!" Appearing to have realized something, Tokjae started crawling along the grass as well. Just then, a couple of red-crowned cranes were gliding slowly across the blue autumn sky with their big wings stretched out.
성삼이는 이미 그 유년 시절의 회상을 통해서 마음이 다 풀려진 상태예요.
Seong-sam gained peace of mind after having childhood flashbacks. He realizes that Dokjae working as deputy chief of a farmers' alliance was not because he was a harsh ideologist. He knows that his friend chose to stay behind just because of his father. We can clearly see the restoration of their friendship, which ultimately motivates Seong-sam to let Dokjae go and save his life. Dokjae too belatedly realizes that and runs off. I think the two would cross paths one day in the future, but for now, it is enough to think that one man saved the life of another and let his old friend live in freedom. The story ends with a lingering image of what a great friendship should be. The writer was trying to show his disappointment and sadness at seeing Koreans hating and killing one another, as well as his yearning for the restoration of fundamental relationships.
근원적 유대의 회복에 대한 염원 같은 것을 잘 느낄 수가 있고
Let's go crane hunting before we go. Hwang Sun-won probably wanted to show a way to overcome the tragic history of the Korean War by writing about the enduring friendship between Seong-sam and Tokjae. That's all we have for this week's edition of Books on Demand. We'll be back next week with another notable Korean literary work for you to enjoy and ponder over. This has been Jenny Jo, and thank you for listening.